The stench of blood and offal hung thick in the air, a miasma that clung to Clara's skin like a second putrid layer. She stood in the doorway of her father's slaughterhouse, watching as he methodically dismembered yet another carcass. The wet slap of meat hitting metal echoed through the cavernous space, a rhythm as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Clara," her father grunted, not looking up from his work. "Fetch me the bone saw." I moved without thinking, my feet carrying me across the blood-slicked floor. The tools of my father's trade gleamed dully in the harsh fluorescent light, each one a potential instrument of death. As I handed him the saw, our eyes met, and I saw something there that made my stomach churn, a hunger that went beyond mere greed. The town of Ashwood had always been a place of secrets and whispered fears. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, dark forests, it was a place where the line between man and beast often blurred. Clara had grown up hearing stories of people who ventured into those woods and never returned, of strange howls in the night that sounded almost human, but it was the slaughterhouse that truly haunted her dreams. The building loomed at the edge of town, a hulking monstrosity of corrugated metal and rusted pipes. Inside, the air was always thick with the coppery scent of blood and the plaintive cries of animals awaiting their fate. Clara's father, Butcher Bill as the townsfolk called him, was a legend in Ashwood. His cuts were perfect, his meat always fresh, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness that made even the hardiest farmers flinch away. As Clara watched her father work, she couldn't help but remember the stories her mother used to tell her before she disappeared. Tales of a time when Ashwood was prosperous, when the fields were green, and the people smiled. But those days were long gone, replaced by a desperate struggle for survival. The sound of tires on gravel pulled Clara from her reverie. Through the grimy windows, she saw a sleek black car pull up outside the slaughterhouse. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, his shoes incongruously shiny against the mud and filth of the yard. "Clara," her father's voice was low and urgent. "Go clean yourself up. We have a visitor." She hurried to obey, scrubbing the blood from her hands and face in the small, dingy bathroom. When she emerged, the stranger was already inside, his eyes roving hungrily over the hanging carcasses. "Mr. Holloway," the man said, extending a manicured hand to her father. "I've heard great things about your operation here." Clara watched as her father shook the man's hand, noting the way his eyes lit up at the word operation. There was something predatory in the stranger's gaze, a hunger that went beyond mere business interest. "Clara," her father said, "why don't you show Mr. Holloway around while I finish up here?" She nodded, leading the stranger through the labyrinthine corridors of the slaughterhouse. As they walked, he peppered her with questions about the business, about the town, about her family. Each answer seemed to feed his appetite for more. "You know," Mr. Holloway said as they paused before a row of meat hooks, "I think your father's operation has real potential. With the right investment, we could turn this place into something truly special." The way he said special sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She turned to face him, and for a moment, she could have sworn his eyes glinted red in the dim light. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Holloway smiled, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. "Oh, my dear," he purred. "I'm talking about expansion. About taking this quaint little business and turning it into an empire." As he spoke, Clara felt a creeping dread settle over her. She remembered the stories of people disappearing into the woods, of strange noises in the night. Suddenly, those tales didn't seem so far-fetched. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Mr. Holloway's offer was too good for her father to refuse, and soon the slaughterhouse was undergoing a massive transformation. New equipment arrived daily, strange machines with blades that gleamed wickedly in the light. But it wasn't just the slaughterhouse that was changing. The whole town seemed to be under a spell. People walked the streets with a glazed look in their eyes, muttering about opportunity and progress. Clara watched as her neighbors, once proud farmers and craftsmen, were reduced to mindless drones, toiling endlessly in the ever-expanding slaughterhouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air itself seemed to thicken with each passing day, heavy with the stench of decay and despair. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of construction, punctuated by what I could have sworn were human screams. It was on a moonless night that Clara finally decided to investigate. Slipping out of her bed, she crept through the silent house and out into the yard. The slaughterhouse loomed before her, its windows glowing with an eerie red light. As she approached, the sounds grew clearer. The mechanical whir of machinery was interspersed with wet, meaty thuds and... yes, those were definitely screams, human screams. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she eased open a side door and slipped inside. The corridor stretched before her, pulsing with that strange red light. She moved forward, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor. The screams grew louder as she approached the main processing area. Peering around a corner, Clara felt her world tilt on its axis. There, strapped to conveyor belts, were not animals, but people. Men, women, even children, their eyes wide with terror as they were fed into massive grinding machines. And there, overseeing it all, was her father. Butcher Bill stood on a raised platform, his once familiar frame now twisted and grotesque. His skin had taken on a sickly gray hue, and his eyes glowed with the same red light that filled the room. Beside him stood Mr. Holloway, his suit impeccable despite the carnage around him. As Clara watched, frozen in horror, he leaned in close to her father's ear. "You see, Bill," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the screams and machinery. "This is true progress. Why settle for mere animals when human flesh fetches such a premium?" Clara's father nodded, a sick grin spreading across his face. "And the town?" he asked. Mr. Holloway waved a dismissive hand. "Fuel for the machine, my friend. Their greed made them easy to manipulate. Now they'll serve a higher purpose." A scream caught in Clara's throat as she realized the full extent of the horror before her. The entire town, her friends and neighbors, were being systematically slaughtered to feed some twisted market for human meat. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She had to do something, had to stop this madness. But as she turned to flee, she found her path blocked by a hulking figure. Now, Clara," Mr. Holloway's voice oozed from behind her. "We can't have you running off and spoiling the surprise." Rough hands grabbed her, dragging her towards the conveyor belt. Clara fought with every ounce of strength she had, kicking and screaming as she was lifted onto the cold metal surface. "Dad!" she cried out, locking eyes with the thing that had once been her father. "Dad, please." For a moment, something flickered in those red eyes. A hint of recognition, perhaps even remorse. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by that same hungry gleam. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, his voice a grotesque parody of paternal affection. "But business is business." As the conveyor belt began to move, carrying her towards the gnashing blades of the meat grinder, Clara's mind raced. This couldn't be how it ended. There had to be a way out, some way to stop this madness. With a surge of desperate strength, she managed to wrench one arm free from her captors. Her hand closed around a nearby meat hook, the metal slick with blood and gore. Without thinking, she swung it in a wide arc, catching one of the workers across the face. The hook tore through flesh and bone with sickening ease, spraying Clara with a fountain of hot blood. The man's scream was cut short as he toppled backwards, his ruined face a mask of shock and pain. Taking advantage of the momentary chaos, Clara rolled off the conveyor belt, hitting the floor hard. She scrambled to her feet, wielding the meat hook like a weapon as she faced down the approaching horde of workers. "Stop her!" Mr. Holloway's voice rang out, filled with fury. Don't let her ruin everything. Clara's father leapt from his platform, landing with inhuman grace. His body seemed to ripple and shift, growing larger, more bestial. Claws sprouted from his fingers, and his jaw elongated into a vicious muzzle. "Oh, Clara," he growled, his voice a guttural parody of itself. "You always were a disappointment." With a roar, he lunged at her. Clara ducked and rolled, feeling the rush of air as his claws barely missed her. She came up swinging, the meat hook connecting with a meaty thud against his side. Her father howled in pain and rage, black blood oozing from the wound. Around them, the machinery continued its grisly work, the screams of the dying providing a horrific backdrop to their battle. Clara fought with the desperation of the damned, her world narrowing to a series of brutal, blood-soaked moments. She dodged and weaved, using her smaller size to her advantage as she struck again and again with the meat hook. But she was tiring, and her father seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. A wild swing caught her across the chest, sending her flying into a bank of controls. Sparks flew as circuits shorted out, and suddenly the room was plunged into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Clara heard Mr. Holloway's voice rise above the din. "Enough of this! Finish her, you fool!" She felt rather than saw her father's approach, the floor trembling beneath his weight. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the gleam of his teeth, the mad light in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," Clara whispered, hefting the meat hook one last time. With all her remaining strength, she swung the hook upwards, feeling it connect with the soft underside of her father's jaw. There was a moment of resistance, and then a sickening crunch as the hook punched through bone and brain. Her father's massive body crashed to the floor, twitching once before going still. In the sudden silence, Clara became aware of a new sound, the hiss and pop of sparking wires. She looked up to see Mr. Holloway silhouetted against the emergency lights, his face a mask of fury. "You little bitch," he snarled, advancing on her. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" But Clara wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the trail of spilled chemicals leading from the shorted-out control panel to the pool of blood surrounding her father's body, a pool that was inching ever closer to the sparking wires. "It's over," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "All of it." Mr. Holloway's eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. The spark jumped, igniting the chemicals and blood in a flash of blue flame that raced across the floor. Clara turned and ran, her legs pumping as she sprinted for the exit. Behind her, she heard Mr. Holloway's scream of rage turn to one of pain and fear as the flames engulfed him. The heat was intense, searing her skin as she burst out into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the damp earth as the slaughterhouse erupted into an inferno behind her. As dawn broke over Ashwood, Clara stood on a hill overlooking the smoldering ruins of the slaughterhouse. The air was thick with ash and the acrid stench of burnt flesh. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching, too late to save anyone trapped inside. She knew that the nightmare wasn't over. The truth of what had happened in Ashwood would come out, and with it would come questions she wasn't sure she could answer. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The pigs had indeed been slaughtered, but in their greed, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. And from the ashes of their twisted dreams, perhaps something new could grow, something better. Clara turned away from the ruins, facing the rising sun. Whatever came next, she would face it. She had survived the slaughterhouse after all, and in doing so, she had learned a valuable lesson. In a world where men could become monsters, sometimes the only way to survive was to become something monstrous yourself. With that thought, Clara began the long walk down the hill, leaving behind the ashes of her old life and stepping into an uncertain but free future.